Story 1. The Stalker on Redwood Street. I was 17 at the time, and my first girlfriend, Zoe, lived just 2 blocks away in a quiet suburban neighborhood near Westbridge. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and I had walked this route 100 times before, without incident. One evening, after school, I decided to head over to her place. The sun was setting, and the streetlights cast long, golden shadows across the pavement. Everything seemed normal, but then, as I walked, I started hearing something subtle at first. The rustling of bushes behind me. I thought it was just the wind, until I heard footsteps light but unmistakable. I turned around, but there was no one there. I brushed it off, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. But then, the footsteps grew louder. They were closer now, too close for comfort. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I turned again, my heart starting to race. But again, there was nothing. The street was empty, nothing but shadows stretching over the road. I quickened my pace, my footsteps hastening as I tried to outrun whatever it was. But the footsteps matched mine closer now, and definitely not my own. I felt my breath quicken as a cold chill ran down my spine. I dialed Zoe's number, my voice trembling as I tried to sound calm. "Hey," said, my heart pounding. "Think someone's following me. I'm kind of freaked out. Where are you?" Zoe's voice was filled with concern, but there was an edge of fear in it too. "Heading down Redwood Street," I replied, forcing myself to stay calm. I walked faster now, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds, scanning the shadows on both sides of the street. "Just stay on the phone with me," Zoe urged. Her voice was a lifeline, pulling me through my growing panic. I turned the corner onto her street, the familiar sight of her house now just up ahead. The porch light flickered softly in the distance, like a beacon of safety. I looked up to the second floor window, where Zoe would usually wave at me. But then I heard her voice again, this time sharper with alarm. "Who's behind you?" she asked. My stomach dropped. I turned slowly, dread settling in. There, just beyond the streetlight's reach, stood a man, a tall figure whose face was obscured by the shadows. But his eyes, they gleamed in the dim light, and that was enough. I knew I had to run. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran as fast as I could, my feet pounding the pavement. My heart thudded in my chest, and I didn't dare look back. I reached Zoe's front door, breathless and panicked. Zoe's mom opened the door immediately, seeing the fear on my face. Zoe came rushing down the stairs, asking what had happened. I barely managed to explain before the police arrived. They found the man near the park. It turned out he had been lurking in the area for weeks, stalking people who passed by. I still feel uneasy every time I walk through that neighborhood. It's like the shadows are watching me, always just out of reach.
Story 2. The man who lived next door. So, for context, I'm a 40-year-old woman now, but this happened when I was 22. Back in 2006, I had just graduated from college, and my apartment lease wasn't up yet, so I decided to stay a little longer. It was a decision I would later regret. To understand the story, I need to explain the layout of the apartment. When you walk through the front door, there's a flight of stairs leading up to the main floor of my apartment. Once you go up those stairs, you're greeted with a full view of my living room and the balcony door. If you stepped out onto the balcony, there's a wooden divider on the left side that separates my balcony from my neighbors. My neighbors were an elderly couple who had been living there longer than I had. I never really interacted with them, so I had no clue what was to come. It started the night I bought my new car. I was standing outside on my balcony, reading the owner's manual while on the phone with my mom. It was likely snowing. Then, I felt the strange, warm breeze and smelled whiskey. I turned my head and found myself face to face with a man leaning over the wooden divider that separated me from my neighbors. I nearly jumped out of my skin and hung up the phone with my mom without saying anything.
"Hey, I'm Peter," the man said, holding his hand out to mine. Hi," I replied, startled. "So, what are you doing out here in the cold?" he asked. "Just reading a book," I said, forcing a smile. Then, as suddenly as he appeared, he vanished.
I quickly grabbed my phone and book and rushed back inside. That was that for the night. The next day, I was getting ready for work when I went outside to get the mail. As I reached the mailbox, I found a note sticking out. It read something along the lines of, "You're very beautiful. Can I take you out on a date?" His name was signed at the bottom. I walked inside, feeling confused, and put the letter on my counter before heading off to work. Later that night, I was in my room reading a book when I heard yelling coming from my neighbor's apartment. They were screaming at each other, and I heard Peter shout at his mother that he would slit her throat. A chill ran down my spine as I heard this. Then, I heard the sound of the sliding glass door slam shut, followed by footsteps on their balcony. My bedroom wall was right next to their balcony, so I could hear everything. The smell of cigarettes and whiskey wafted in again. I somehow fell asleep, but woke up later to use the bathroom. As I walked past the sliding glass door toward the bathroom, I heard Peter's voice from outside, "Get back in bed, Bertie." The way he called me Bertie made my stomach drop. I rushed into the bathroom, then hurried back to bed as fast as I could. At just 18, I didn't think through my choices very well. I went back to sleep. The next morning, I woke up to a cold breeze. I shot up, my eyes darting around the room, trying to figure out where it was coming from. I found nothing, so I walked into the kitchen and froze. The balcony door was wide open. There was a note on my kitchen counter. I slammed the door shut, noticing the lock was gone from the handle, realizing my apartment had been broken into. I picked up the note with shaky hands. It was a full paragraph about how I should go on a date with him. And at the bottom, it said, "Cy promised you won't regret it." The rest of the day, I was paranoid, wondering if he would come back. That night, I was once again on the phone with my mom, when I suddenly heard pounding on my walls. Someone was running down the hallway, banging on walls and doors. I told my mom what was happening, and she advised me not to answer. I stood still by the door as the pounding continued, then suddenly stopped. I told my mom I had to go. As I walked back into the living room, I froze. There he was, standing in the middle of the room, staring at me. "Why didn't you answer the door?" he asked, his tone cold. "I was in the shower," I lied, clearly nervous. "Okay," he replied, before climbing around the divider and leaving. That was the last time I saw him. A week later, my lease was up. I spoke to my landlord about this, then started to pack my stuff. After I moved out, I didn't hear anything for about a month. Then, my landlord called me to let me know that a young couple had moved into my old apartment. Peter had broken in multiple times and even smashed their windows. The couple finally had enough and called the cops. When the police arrived, they arrested Peter on the spot. Apparently, they found him lurking near the apartment again, and after some questioning, they discovered that he had been living in the building for months without anyone noticing.
Story 3: The Stranger in Greenwood Hills. I've always loved living on the edge of Greenwood Hills, surrounded by the dense woods and peaceful trails. My German Shepherd, Max, and I would take evening walks through the forest behind the house almost every day. The kind of walk that clears your mind, the kind that feels like time slows down and you can breathe easy. That evening, the sun was setting, casting a golden light through the canopy of trees, making the world seem even more serene than usual. I didn't think anything of it when I stepped out with Max that night. It was a familiar path, one I had walked 1,000 times before. The kind of walk you do without really thinking, just enjoying the peace and quiet, the rustling of the leaves, the call of a distant bird. But that night, something felt different. We weren't far into the woods when I first saw him, a man walking toward us on the trail. His face was hidden under a dark hood, and he moved with an odd kind of stillness, like he didn't belong in the world around him. I gave him a quick wave, offering a friendly good evening, but he didn't respond. Not even a glance. His eyes were fixed on the ground, his steps deliberate. Max, however, wasn't having any of it. She immediately started growling, her tail stiffening and her body tensing. She wasn't like this with strangers. She was usually calm, even around unfamiliar faces, but tonight was different. She kept pulling at the leash, barking and snapping at the air. I tugged on her leash, trying to get her to calm down, but she was relentless. I looked up, expecting to see the man walking past us, but he wasn't. Instead, he had stopped. He was standing just a few feet behind us, his head still lowered, his presence unsettling in the stillness of the woods. A chill ran down my spine. Something wasn't right. I told Max to keep moving, my voice a little more forceful now. We started walking faster, but when I glanced over my shoulder, the man was still there. He hadn't moved, but he was still just a few paces behind, following us in a way that felt deliberate and unnerving. I quickened my pace again, trying to get away, but every time I looked back, his footsteps matched mine. It was like he was right there, just out of reach. A feeling of dread settled in my stomach, and I felt the weight of his gaze, even though I couldn't see his eyes. "Come on, Max," I muttered, trying to get her to stop barking. She wasn't having it though. Her growls deepened, and I could feel her pulling harder, tugging me in the opposite direction. That's when I realized he wasn't just behind us anymore. He was closing in. Before I could react, the man darted from the trees beside the trail and grabbed my arm. His fingers were ice cold, and the grip was like something out of a nightmare. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest, my mind screaming at me to get away. Max went wild, snapping at the man's legs, and for the briefest moment, I thought she was going to tear him apart. That was enough for the man. With a hiss of frustration, he released me, but I didn't wait another second. I yanked my arm free and bolted for the house, not even looking back. Max was still barking like a mad dog, pulling me as fast as I could run. I didn't stop until I was at the door, slamming it shut behind me and practically collapsing in a heap on the floor. My wife, startled by my panic, opened the door as I burst in. I could hardly catch my breath long enough to explain what happened. I immediately called the sheriff. He came out with his deputies, but by the time they reached the woods, the man was gone vanished without a trace. They found no sign of him. No footprints, no broken branches. Nothing to show that anyone had been there at all. I'm not sure what happened that night, but I'll never forget the feeling of that cold hand on my arm, the icy grip that seemed to freeze the very air around me. From that point on, I couldn't walk those trails the same way again. Max and I stayed closer to the house, always glancing over our shoulders, the haunting presence of the stranger always lingering in my mind. The woods were no longer peaceful to me. They felt alive, like something was out there, watching and waiting.